in his arms. He will carry them in his bosom and gently lead those who are with young. Notice the word arm in both verses. In verse 10, his arm is an arm of might. It's an arm of strength. It's a warrior's arm, an arm for battle. But in verse 11, it's an arm of tenderness, the mother's arm who would bring her children into her lap and into her bosom and give them comfort. Behold the might of this God who created the universe by just speaking, "Let there be." And when he speaks, stars ignite and planets lock into orbit, rivers run and oceans fill the earth's floors, valleys sink and the mountains race to the sky. Behold the tenderness of this God who carries us right next to his heart when we are weak, so that he will not break a bruised reed or snuff out a smoldering wick, who invites all the weary and the heavy laden to come to him for rest. J.I. Packer, in his great work, Knowing God, says that to form a right idea of God's greatness, we must consistently do two things. He says we must remove from our thoughts any limitations that would make him seem small. Remove any limitations that would make him seem small. Secondly, we need to regularly compare him with the powers and the forces that we normally think of as great in our eyes. The things that we often fear or cower before. Those are the things that we need to compare before God, the Goliaths of our life. We need to compare that God is greater than even those big things. And Isaiah does both of those things in this passage. So notice, number one, we see that God's majesty has no limitations. Look at verse 12. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales or the hills in balance? Obviously, the answer to that is nobody could do that except our God, the one that Isaiah is presenting to them. This is the God that promised comfort. Comfort is nice, but only if you can deliver it, and this God can. So letter A then, compare God's majesty to the creation. What kind of God is this? Isaiah reports, who has measured the waters in the hollows of his hand? God is able to measure the waters of the earth, the oceans of the earth, in the hollow of his hand. Now, open up your hand and think about what can fit in my hand. I can fit a ping pong ball, I can fit a golf ball, I can fit a baseball or a softball. Some people can palm a basketball, I can't. But God can hold all of the oceans of all of the world in his hand, in the hollow of his hand. If you look at all the world's oceans, they contain 321,253,800 cubic miles of water. Now, a cubic mile is a mile this way, and this way. And God says, I've got it all right there in the palm of my hand. And that's how big God is. And he's bigger than all of our problems. And that's what guarantees our comfort. The second part of this question shows again how majestic God is. It says, who marked off the heavens with a span. Now, the span is the distance between your little finger and your thumb. And again, you can only hold a few things that way. But God can palm the whole world, the whole 25,326 miles around its circumference. But notice that Isaiah is saying that God has marked off the heavens with a span. He holds the whole universe, which is 300 sextillion miles, is their best estimate now, to the edge of the universe. And God holds all that in his hand. Now, a light year is how far light can travel in a year. If you remember that 1 second light travels 186,282 miles. If you were a traveler, you could go around the circumference of the earth 7.5 times in 1 second if you could travel at the speed of light. If you could travel at the speed of light, you could get to the sun in 8 minutes. But it still takes to the nearest star, Proxima Centauri, which is 4.25 light years away, it would still take you billions of years to get there. I think God is big enough to take care of any of my problems. Don't you? How big are your problems? Are they bigger than the oceans? Are they more expansive than the heavens? As Israel looked back from Babylon, the promises of God seemed to be buried. How would God give Israel an everlasting kingdom when they were slaves in a foreign land? How would God make Israel a blessing to the world when they were living under the curse? How would God raise up from Israel a serpent-crushing king when they were under Babylon's heel? And we might ask similar questions when we remember God's promises out of the wreckage of our circumstances. We can look ahead to a life of unwanted singleness and ask, how can God satisfy me? We can look back at a devastating failure and ask, how could God forgive me? We could look up from the crater of some loss and ask, how could God comfort me? In those moments, we need God to do for us what He did for Israel. We need Him to come alongside us, remind us of His promises, and say, look at your God. Behold, your God. Someone has defined circumstances, those things that we say, well, I'm fine except under the circumstances. Anyway, somebody defined circumstances as those nasty things you see when you take your eyes off God. Hudson Taylor, the great missionary to China, once said, many Christians estimate difficulty in light of their own resources, and thus they attempt very little, and they always fail. All giants have been weak men who did great things for God because they reckoned on His power and His presence to be with them. Now this verse 12, also says, He enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance. He's saying that the dust of the earth, it all fits in God's cup. The mighty mountains from the Rockies to the Alps to the Himalayas fit on His scales, and the hills in His balance. And all of that makes me feel awfully small, doesn't it, you? Hopefully it makes God bigger. Now jump down to verse 21 and 22. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. If you're feeling awfully small compared to God's vast universe, it's because we are. We feel like grasshoppers because we are. We're even smaller than that. As God sits on the circle of the earth. I mean, how many of you have ever flown in a jet, okay? You're traveling overseas, and the farther you get up, everything on the ground, even the large buildings and the mountains, begin to look like nothing, right? And that's why when astronauts get out into space and they look back at this earth, this globe, and they look at it and they feel so tiny, and they feel so big, they feel like God is so big, and they just want to praise Him. But God is bigger than all that. The world dwarfs us, and God dwarfs the world. As Junior said in VeggieTales, God is bigger than the boogeyman. He's bigger than Godzilla and the monsters on TV. Oh, God is bigger than the boogeyman. He's watching out for you and me. And that's what He's doing. Sitting above the circle of the earth, He's watching over our lives. Our God is big. Behold, your God. He stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Now, we're on planet Earth, okay? I'm going to represent planet Earth by this golf ball hill, which is painted like an earth. And we are situated 93 million miles from our star, the sun. Now, imagine that 93 million miles is represented by a single piece of paper, okay? That's the distance between us and our sun, represented by that single piece of paper. The nearest star, aside from our sun, is Proxima Centauri. That distance would need a stack of paper 71 feet high. Every one of those pieces of paper representing 93 million miles. The size of our galaxy would be represented by a stack that's 310 miles high. And that's just our galaxy. It's one of millions of galaxies stretched across this universe. The known universe would be like 31 million miles of paper, each representing 93 million miles. So the stars are huge. Our sun is not the largest in the universe. When I studied this back in the 1980s, Canis Majoris was the largest star that was discovered at that time. Canis Majoris means big dog, okay? And Canis Majoris is so big that if our sun were the size of a golf ball, Canis Majoris would be the size of Mount Everest. You could fit 91 billion suns into Canis Majoris. That's how huge things are in our universe. That's why when David looked out at the heavens and the moon and the stars, he says, what is man that you're mindful of him, that you even give him a thought, that you are concerned about us? And yet he is. Next thing that Isaiah does is he compares God's greatness and majesty to the nations. You know, a lot of times it is these things that cause us the most consternation. Iran attacking Israel, Russia and Ukraine, or our enemies. We think of nations as mighty things that it's hard to stand against. For God, they're a drop in the bucket. They're less than nothing. Look at verses 15 to 17. Behold, the nations, and at this time they would be thinking of Babylon, the mightiest nation on earth at the time. The nations are like a drop from a bucket, and they're accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes the coastlands like fine dust. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor its beasts enough for burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. And then look at verse 23. We think about rulers on the earth. He says, who brings princes to nothing. And he makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Now we use a drop in the bucket. It's kind of a figure of speech. It's the idea that it's an insufficient or inconsequential amount compared to all of the water that's in the bucket or all of the water that's in the ocean. And he said, that's the way the nations are before God. They're just a small, tiny, inconsequential thing related to all of the things that God rules and reigns over and has control over. And we might be intimidated. And Israel could have been intimidated by the nations that were surrounding her. But God considered them as less than nothing. He goes on to clarify all the nations are as nothing before him. They're nothing and they're emptiness. We tremble before the nations. Sometimes they seem to be mighty and we seem to be weak, but God is so much greater than the nations that even combined, even all of them together, he regards them as less than nothing. All these fearful despots, they come and go. The Hitlers, the Stalins, the Neros, they're dead and gone. God remains. He's still there. And they're less than nothing. Every election, I remind myself of these verses from Psalm 33, verses 10 and 11. The Lord brings the counsels of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the people. The counsel of the Lord stands forever. The plans of his heart to all generations. His will be done. Verse 24 says about these leaders, he says, scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth when the wind blows on them and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like rubble. These terrifying nations and these mighty, evil, terrifying rulers will be gone. They don't last forever. God, however, is a secure leader. He's the only one. He's never up for re-election. He doesn't have to worry about polls or pander to the people's wishes. There are no coups. He reigns forever. And here Isaiah picks up the refrain from back in verse 18. In verse 25 he repeats, to whom then will you compare me, that I should be like him, says the Holy One. Now, we're not dealing with these verses, but one of the temptations that Israel had, and they'd had it for hundreds of years, is the temptation to turn to idols and to expect that those idols would be the ones to deliver them, or those idols would be the ones to bless them. And anytime you make an idol, and he makes fun of them by saying, you make an idol out of wood, you burn part of it to cook your meal, and the other part you make into a god. Or you have to carry these gods around. They don't even have feet to be able to move themselves. They don't have mouths to be able to speak for themselves. They can't tell the future. Isaiah, throughout these chapters in Isaiah 40 through 46 and so on, he's really focusing upon the inability of these idols to do what you think, you hope, you want them to do. And he says only God can do those things. God is the one who can. So finally, Isaiah encourages the people to compare him to the stars of heaven. Lift up your eyes and see, verse 26. Who created these? Who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name? By the greatness of his might and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. Do you realize how amazing this is? When you go out on a clear night, you gaze up into the nighttime sky, nothing gives us a greater sense of our own remoteness and insignificance and smallness as looking up into the vast heavens and the sextillions and sextillions of stars there. Now Isaiah, he could look up into the sky and he could see perhaps tens of thousands of stars, but what great wonder should we have, because we can even see far more today, and our minds should reel, our imaginations should hardly grasp it when we try to conceive the unfathomable depths of this universe. And we're left just numb and dizzy. And all this vast universe was created by a breath of God's mouth. Psalm 33 verse 6 says, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made, by the breath of his mouth all their host. Remember what Psalm 8 said? When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him? Or the Son of Man that you care for him? How could we capture God's attention when we are such a minuscule part of all of this vast universe? Psalm 147 verses 4 and 5 says that God calls all of these 300 sextillion stars by name. He knows them. And if God knows 300 sextillion stars by name, I don't think it's a big problem for him to know 6 billion people by name and to know all of their problems and all of the things that they struggle with, all of their insecurities, all their fears, all their anxieties. He says in verse 26, lift up your eyes and see who created these. He who brings out their host by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, because he is strong in power, not one of them is missing. Take a look at the Whirlpool galaxy. You thought that was just a washing machine, right? It is 30 million light years away, close to 180 trillion light years away. That's a long way away. There are 300 billion stars in that galaxy. And let's say the Earth were the size of this golf ball. This one actually looks like the Earth. And we're right about there. If I marked it, don't worry, it wouldn't ruin my golf game or anything like that. But if I marked it, it would show just how immensely small we are. So if the Earth was the size of a golf ball, Jupiter would be the size of a beach ball. And you can see a representation on the screen. The sun would be the size of the screen itself. And our sun is just an average-sized star. God knows them all by name. He created them with the breath of his mouth. You know, as hot as some of those stars are, he must have been eating some habaneros before he did that. I can't even think of that without getting heartburn. But, you know, our sun burns at about 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's just parts of it. Other parts get up to 16,000 degrees. And what does Isaiah want us to do? Behold, your God. This is your God. So 2 applications today. First, if we don't consistently feed our minds and our hearts on the greatness of God, it'll be too easy and we'll too quickly slide into wrong thoughts about God. We'll begin to slide into thinking of God in ways that are less worthy of him, as less accurate as he actually is. Isaiah rebukes us by twice saying, to whom will you compare me? Is there anybody, is there anything that you could compare my might, my wisdom, my power, my greatness to? There's nothing. And just because we are weak and fearless and powerless doesn't mean that God is weak and fearless and powerless. And there will come a time that you'll need a big God in your life. And if you don't feed your heart and your mind on that reality now, more than likely when that time comes that you need a big God, you won't have him there in your heart and mind, and your life will fall apart because you're depending upon yourself. And that leads us to the second thing, because God is so great and so mighty, we need to remind ourselves to cease depending upon ourselves and to depend upon him for strength and wisdom. Sometimes we feel, as is mentioned here in Isaiah chapter 40, that our way is hidden from God and our cause is disregarded by God. But that's as false as it is irreverent, because God doesn't forget, he doesn't overlook, he doesn't lose interest in the status and the needs of his children. If he can name and keep track of 600 trillion stars, then he can keep track of all the people on this earth. The struggles of our faith are won and lost by our perception of reality, by what we believe about God. Isaiah is saying, look at it this way, my children. God is really, and I mean really big.